The first time we underestimated a human, and why the Concord never did again. 41 years. That is how long I have served in the Xenological Assessment Corps of the Concord, and in that time I have made first contact with 11 sapient species. I have watched hive minds argue with themselves for 6 hours over whether to say hello. I have negotiated a ceasefire with a species that communicates exclusively through bioluminescent pattern and considers silence a mortal insult. I thought I understood the shape of fear a species could put into a first contact report. I thought wrong, and I want to tell you exactly how wrong, because every cadet who has ever complained to me about the mandatory human physiology module owes their careful, healthy respect for that species to one small rescue mission that was never supposed to matter. Before I explain what happened aboard the human vessel designated Harlow's Reach, you need to understand what the galaxy looked like before humanity officially joined it. We had a catalog. Every spacefaring or near spacefaring species got sorted the moment we detected their first radio leakage or their first crude orbital hardware, and the sorting was brutally simple: threat tier, technology tier, biological resilience tier. The Ventrisi scored high on technology and low on biological resilience. Brilliant engineers could be killed by a bad cold. The Corundine scored high on resilience and low on technology, nearly indestructible, still throwing spears when we found them. Every species we had ever catalogued fell somewhere on that spectrum, a trade-off, always a trade-off, because evolution does not hand out free lunches. That was the rule. That was physics as much as biology. You do not get a species that is simultaneously fragile-looking and nearly unkillable, clever and savage, gentle and utterly without limit when provoked. The math does not work. Humanity broke the math, and we found that out by accident, on a rescue mission nobody wanted, 311 years before this recording, when a Concord relay station, called Kestrel Anchor, picked up a distress beacon from a ship that our threat assessment had rated. And I want you to remember this number, a 2 out of 10. I was the junior xenolinguist on the response team. My superior officer was Instructor Commodore Yeth Sorenval, a Halberin, 3 meters of chitin-plated comm, 4 centuries old, a veteran of the Ventrisi border skirmishes, and, I will say now, the single most unshakable officer I ever served under. He is the reason I am alive to record this. He is also the reason I am telling you this story at all, because he made me write the official report, and writing that report is what convinced the Concord Assembly to create the very Deathworlder classification and the Academy protocols that some of you are living through right now. Kestrel Anchor's sensors had flagged Harlow's Reach. 6 hours before we arrived, a registered human survey and mining vessel, crude complement listed at 14, currently venting atmosphere from 3 separate hull breaches, drifting derelict on a decaying orbit around a gas giant nobody had bothered naming. Our scans found no active weapon signatures, no shields, engines offline, and a life sign reading so faint and erratic that our medical officer, a soft-spoken Ilventry named Dree, quietly told the boarding team to prepare for a body recovery mission rather than a rescue. Humans, according to every file we had on record at that point, were baseline mammalian bipeds from a single homeworld, technologically adolescent, biologically unremarkable, soft tissue, exposed skin, no natural armor, no venom, no claws worth the name, average bone density, unexceptional strength-to-mass ratio. On paper, a strong wind should have worried them. We had assessed them the way you assess a species you expect to either die quietly or need everything done for them. We boarded expecting corpses. What we found instead started rewriting 3 centuries of xenobiological doctrine within the first 11 minutes. The docking clamp fused wrong because half of Harlow's Reach hull plating had been welded back together by hand and not with proper tools, with whatever the crew had managed to scavenge and jury-rig into something that could hold pressure. Commodore Sorenval noted this immediately and flagged it in his log as improvised structural competence, unexpected for stated technology tier. I did not understand yet why that detail mattered so much to him. I understand now. It was the first crack in the catalog. We cut our way through a bulkhead into a corridor lit only by handheld emergency lamps, the air thick with recycled ozone and the particular acrid smell of scorched insulation, and the first human I ever laid eyes on was crouched over an access panel, with her hands buried in exposed wiring up to the wrist, not flinching from the sparks jumping off a severed conduit 6 centimeters from her face. She looked up at 4 armored aliens cutting through her hull, blinked once, and said, in a flat, exhausted voice that our translators rendered with startling clarity, "You're either here to help or here to finish the job." Which is it? Because I really don't have the bandwidth for both conversations. Her name, we would later learn, was Chief Engineer Mireille Okafor, and she was, by every metric our scanners could give us, running on fumes, elevated stress hormones, dehydration markers, a laceration across her forearm that she had field-dressed herself with what looked like a strip torn from her own uniform, tied off with a knot so efficient our medical officer photographed it for later study. She had been awake, by her own account given later, for over 40 hours, and she was still working. Not resting, not signaling distress, not doing any of the things every prior species in our catalog did when a rescue team finally arrived. She was still trying to fix the ship, because in her words, the ship isn't going to fix itself while I wait for someone else to save me. Commodore Sorenval asked her, through the translator, what had happened. She gave us the short version while she kept working, hands never stopping. Micrometeoroid cluster, worse than the ship's ancient sensor suite had predicted. 3 simultaneous hull breaches, life support cascading toward failure, half her crew injured, and this was the detail that made Dree go very quiet beside me. Something had gotten in through breach 2 before the emergency bulkheads sealed. Something alive, something that was not supposed to be aboard a human survey vessel at all. I need to explain what a void rack is, for this story to land properly, for those of you who have not sat through the Concord's exobiology briefings. It is not a species we catalog kindly. Void racks are ambush predators that drift dormant in the debris fields around gas giants, essentially living pressure hulls themselves, capable of surviving hard vacuum indefinitely, and they wake up the moment they detect a warm hull breach venting atmosphere, because a breached ship means trapped, wounded, disoriented prey in an enclosed space. We do not send unarmed personnel near a confirmed void rack contact. We send hazard teams in heavy void armor, with plasma cutters rated for exactly this purpose, and even then, casualties are considered an acceptable statistical certainty, not an anomaly. A void rack loose inside a derelict, atmosphere-venting human survey ship, crewed by 14 technologically adolescent baseline mammals with no void combat training whatsoever, should have been, by every model our tactical division could generate, a complete loss. 14 confirmed dead, ship a drifting tomb, mission report filed under tragic but unsurprising. That is not what we found. We found 6 humans, including Chief Engineer Okafor, alive, conscious, and functionally organized in a way that made Commodore Sorenval stop dead in the corridor and simply stare for 11 full seconds, which for a 400-year-old Halberin veteran is the emotional equivalent of screaming. The other 8 crew members, we learned, had been wounded in the initial breach and were being tended in the aft medical bay by a human named Petty Officer Dae-Jung Lim, who, we would discover, held no formal medical qualification whatsoever and had learned battlefield triage from what she described as a first aid course and a lot of nerve. She had kept 8 critically injured people alive for over 40 hours, using improvised tourniquets, a manual pressure cuff blood transfusion rig she had built from spare ship parts because the automated medical suite had lost power in breach 2, and I want to stress this, because Dree included it verbatim in the official Concord Medical Archive. Sheer refusal to let anyone she was responsible for die on her watch. And the void rack, the thing that should have ended this ship's story in the first 90 minutes. It was dead. It had been dead for roughly 31 hours by the time we found it, according to Dree's later biological assessment. It had not died from any weapon our catalog recognized. It had died from repeated, sustained, targeted blunt force trauma to its primary ganglion cluster, delivered, as far as our forensic reconstruction could determine, by 4 humans working in coordinated rotation, using a length of structural support pipe as an improvised weapon, in zero gravity, in a section of the ship still venting atmosphere, while wearing nothing but standard-issue survival suits never designed for combat. I want you to sit with that. A void rack is roughly 4 meters across. Encased in a pressure-resistant carapace our own hazard teams need plasma cutters to reliably breach, and it moves through debris fields the way a shadow moves through a lit room. You do not see it coming, you see the aftermath. 4 unarmored, technologically adolescent baseline mammals had located it, cornered it, and beaten it to death with plumbing, and then gone back to triaging their wounded crewmates as though this was simply Tuesday. When Commodore Sorenval finally found his voice and asked the obvious question, how, the human who answered was not Okafor. It was a quiet, unassuming crewman named Tomas Reyes, mid-30s by human reckoning, listed on the manifest simply as cargo specialist, who I will confess I had not even registered as remarkable until that moment, because he had spent the entire encounter standing near the wounded, saying almost nothing, doing the unglamorous work of holding pressure bandages and passing tools. He looked at the Commodore with an expression I have since learned to recognize on human faces, a kind of tired, almost apologetic honesty, and said, "It came through the breach after Marcus. We didn't have a choice." You don't wait around figuring out the smart plan when something's already killing your people. You grab whatever's closest and you commit, because hesitating is how everyone dies instead of just one person. Commodore Sorenval asked him whether he had been afraid. Reyes considered the question with what looked like genuine effort, the way you consider a question you have never actually thought to ask yourself, and said, "Yeah, the whole time. Being scared doesn't really change what you have to do, though. It just changes how much it costs you afterward." I did not understand, in that corridor, why Commodore Sorenval went so still when he heard that answer. I understand now, because I have spent 4 decades studying humans since, and I have come to recognize that sentence as close to a species-level thesis statement as you will ever hear. Fear, for most of the species in our catalog, is a stop signal. It tells you to flee, to freeze, to defer to someone stronger. For humans, we would eventually learn, fear is closer to a toll you pay on the way through, not a wall you stop at. It costs them. It costs them dearly, and they do the thing anyway, and then they carry that cost afterward, in ways their own species has not fully solved for, which is, if you want the honest and slightly uncomfortable truth of it, the actual dark heart of why humans make such devastatingly effective soldiers, rescue workers, and first responders, not because they feel nothing, but because they have collectively decided, as a culture, across every nation and background represented on that ship, that feeling something is not a permission slip to stop. Before I move on, I want to walk through the fight itself, in more detail than Commodore Sorenval's official report allowed, because the report was written for the Concord Assembly, and the Assembly, in its infinite bureaucratic caution, does not like the word improbable appearing more than once per paragraph. I heard the full account directly from the 4 crew members involved, pieced together over the 9 hours we spent aboard that ship, and I have carried it with me ever since as the clearest single illustration of what makes this species genuinely, structurally different from everything else in our catalog. When the Void Rack came through Breach 2, it did not announce itself the way our tactical doctrine assumes a predator will. There was no roar, no visible charge. One moment crewman Marcus Delgado was securing a loose panel near the breach, and the next moment he was simply gone, dragged backward into the dark venting atmosphere with a speed that, according to the ship's damaged internal sensors, our own hazard team's reflex models would not have reacted to in time. Reyes told me later that the first thing any of them actually saw of the creature was Delgado's emergency beacon going dark, and then his voice, badly injured but alive, coming through on comms from somewhere in the flooded cargo section, saying 3 words that Reyes repeated to Commodore Sorenval with a kind of flat, exhausted precision. It's still here. That is the detail our own tactical instructors could not stop discussing for months afterward. 4 humans, with no void combat training, no weapons rated for anything larger than shipboard pest control, and a crewmate confirmed alive but trapped with an apex predator in a section of ship actively losing atmosphere, did not retreat to a defensible position and wait for help, which is what every single species doctrine in the Concord catalog recommends in that exact scenario, including, I will note with some professional embarrassment, our own. They went in. Okafor grabbed the nearest length of structural pipe from an open maintenance locker. A second engineer, a woman named Priya Anand, who did not survive to be interviewed by us because she died of her injuries 8 days after we returned the ship to port, and whose name I make a point of saying aloud in every version of this lecture I give, grabbed a fire suppression canister and improvised it into a directional weapon by rupturing the seal and using the pressurized discharge to disorient the creature's sensory cluster. Reyes and a 4th crewman, a young reactor technician named Bo Lindquist, who could not have been more than 23 years old, went in with him. They found the void rack in near total darkness, in 0 gravity, in a compartment still venting atmosphere, through a breach none of them had time to seal first, with Delgado alive, but pinned beneath one of the creature's limbs, conscious enough to scream. Anand's improvised gas discharge bought them perhaps 4 seconds of disorientation. 4 seconds, in that compartment, against that creature, is nothing. It is barely enough time to register that you are still alive. It was enough time for Okafor and Reyes to get inside the creature's reach and begin striking its primary ganglion cluster, a target our own combat manuals mark as requiring precision instrumentation to reliably locate, and which these 4 humans found by what Reyes described afterward, with the same flat honesty he seemed to bring to every question, as just hitting the part that made it flinch hardest, and not stopping. They did not stop for 11 minutes. I want that number to land properly, because 11 minutes of sustained close-quarters combat against an apex predator, in 0 gravity, in a compartment-venting atmosphere, with improvised tools and no armor, is not a fight our own hazard teams train for as survivable. It is a fight our doctrine treats as a controlled retreat scenario. The humans treated it as a problem that needed solving before someone they cared about died, and they kept solving it, taking turns when one of them tired, dragging Delgado clear when there was an opening, going back in when there wasn't, until the creature stopped moving and stayed stopped. Anand's injuries from that 11 minutes, a puncture wound from one of the creature's limbs that none of our medical scans initially flagged as critical, proved fatal despite Petty Officer Lim's efforts, and I think it is important that this story does not pretend the cost was 0. It was not 0. Humans do not, as a rule, walk away from these encounters unscathed, and the ones who survive carry the ones who did not with them for the rest of their lives. Which brings me back to something Reyes said to me privately, later, when the ship was safe and the adrenaline had finally worn thin enough for him to sit still. He said, "Priya's the reason the rest of us are having this conversation right now. I need that to be in whatever report you write, not the part where we won, the part where she's the reason we got to. I have made sure, in every lecture, in every version of this record, that it is." We spent the next 9 hours helping the human crew stabilize. Harlow's reach. And I want to describe what that looked like, because it mattered as much as the void rack. Once the immediate crisis passed, once the wounded were stable, and the breaches were sealed, and the ship was no longer actively dying, the humans did not collapse into the relief shock our own species would have shown. They organized a work rotation. They cracked dry, exhausted jokes about the state of their own emergency rations. Okafor, still running on no sleep and a field-dressed wound, spent 2 of those 9 hours teaching our own engineering officer, a Ventrisi named Ket, a jury-rig technique for stabilizing a fusion coupling using nothing but salvaged wire and what she called, and I have never forgotten this phrase, spite and duct tape. Ket later told me it was the single most elegant piece of improvised engineering he had encountered in 80 years of service, and he had learned it from a woman who, by every biological measure we possessed, should have been unconscious from exhaustion 3 hours earlier. Petty Officer Lim, once her patient stabilized, spent an hour sitting with Dree comparing medical technique, and I watched our 400-year-old Ilventry medical officer, a being who had trained in facilities that made human hospitals look like field tents, take notes, actual notes, on techniques a human had improvised from a first aid course and raw nerve. Dree told me afterward, quietly, in the shuttle back to Kestrel Anchor, that she believed human battlefield medicine, born from necessity rather than institutional luxury, contained more genuinely novel triage innovation than anything the Concord's medical academies had produced in the last century, because Concord medicine had never had to be improvised by someone with nothing, under fire, for people they loved. Human medicine, she said, had been born exactly that way, over and over, for the entirety of their recorded history, and it showed in ways that unsettled her more than the void rack had. By the time we towed Harlow's Reach back to Kestrel Anchor, Commodore Sorenval had already begun drafting what would become the founding document of the Deathworlder classification, and he let me read it before he filed it, which I have always taken as one of the great honors of my career. I remember the central paragraph almost word for word, because I have quoted it in every lecture I have given since. He wrote, "This assessment team arrived expecting to recover bodies from a 2 out of 10 threat tier vessel. We instead found 6 baseline mammals who had, without training, without proper weapons, and without any expectation of rescue, defeated a confirmed apex ambush predator through pure coordinated improvisation, while simultaneously running triage operations that our own medical corps found instructive. I am recommending the Concord Assembly immediately suspend the current threat tier catalog as applied to humanity pending a full reassessment, because our existing model assumes technological and biological capability exist on a single trade-off spectrum, and this species appears to have found some way to sidestep that spectrum entirely. I do not yet understand the mechanism. I strongly recommend we find out before, rather than after, humanity encounters something it cannot improvise its way past." I should mention, because it is the part of this story the Concord Assembly least enjoyed hearing, that Commodore Sorenval's recommendation did not land easily. The Assembly's initial response, drafted by a review committee that had never left a station deck in decades, was to classify the Harlow's Reach incident as a statistical outlier, an exceptional crew, perhaps military trained despite their civilian designation, not representative of baseline human capability. Sorenval was, by his own later admission to me, furious in a way I had never seen from him before or since. He requested, and was eventually granted, authorization to pull records on every documented human encounter with hostile wildlife across every human colony and survey outpost the Concord had passive sensor data on, going back as far as our observation network reached. What came back was not one outlier. It was a pattern spanning centuries, dozens of separate human settlements, hundreds of individually unremarkable people who, when the moment demanded it, simply did not stop. Mining crews who fought off predators with tools never designed for combat. Rescue workers who went into collapsing structures other species' doctrine would have written off as unrecoverable. Colonial militia, with equipment 2 full technology tiers behind Concord standard, holding territory against threats our own risk models rated unsurvivable, because retreating meant leaving someone behind, and leaving someone behind was, for reasons our sociologists are still only partially able to model, simply not on the list of options most humans allowed themselves to consider. That reassessment took the Concord 11 years, 400 embedded observers, and a genuinely staggering amount of institutional pride swallowing, and it is the direct reason the Deathworlder designation exists at all, the direct reason your academy runs mandatory human physiology and combat theory modules. The direct reason every cadet reading this has probably already heard some version of the stories that came after, the combat class incidents, the arena legends, the classroom assignments no alien student expected a human to finish, let alone finish first. Every one of those stories, every human cadet who ever calmly dismantled 3 overconfident bullies and went back to studying for an exam afterward, traces back to a drifting mining ship, a dead void rack, and 6 exhausted humans who did not know they were making history because they were too busy keeping each other alive. There is one more exchange from those 9 hours aboard. Harlow's Reach. That I have never included in an official report, because it did not belong in one, but I include it here because I think it explains humanity better than the void rack ever could. Somewhere around the 6th hour, once the reactor coupling was stable and the wounded were sleeping, and there was, for the first time since we had boarded, genuinely nothing urgent left to do, I found young Bo Lindquist sitting alone near the sealed breach where Anand had died. Not crying exactly, but very still, in the particular way I have since learned humans go still when something has not finished hurting yet. I did not know, at 23 years of standard service, what the correct xenolinguistic protocol was for approaching a grieving member of a species we had known for less than a day, so I did what felt honest instead, which was to simply sit down near him and say nothing. After a while, he spoke without looking at me. He said the thing that had scared him most in that compartment was not the creature. It was the half-second right before they went in, where some part of him had genuinely, coldly calculated the odds and understood that going in anyway was probably going to get some of them killed, and he had gone in anyway, and he wanted to know, from an outside species, from someone who had presumably seen a great many things in a great many first contacts, whether that made him brave or just reckless, because he genuinely could not tell the difference anymore, and it was eating at him. I did not have a good answer for him then. I have thought about that question for 4 decades since, and the closest thing I have to an answer now is this. I do not believe your species draws that line where you think it does. I have studied 100 cultures since that day, and in most of them, courage is a story told afterward, a virtue assigned in hindsight to people who happen to survive their own risk-taking. What I watched aboard Harlow's Reach was not a story being written for later. It was 6 people making a series of small, repeated, unglamorous decisions, over and over, for hours, to keep showing up for each other, long after the version of courage your entertainment media likes to romanticize had already worn off into something much more exhausting and much less cinematic, the simple, grinding refusal to be the one who stopped trying first. I told Lindquist that I thought the difference between brave and reckless was not a line he needed to find in the moment. It was a question that only mattered afterward, when you had the safety to ask it, and the fact that he was sitting there asking it at all, instead of pretending the fear had never existed, told me more about his species' capacity for genuine courage than any amount of confident bravado could have. He did not say much after that. He just nodded and eventually went back to help with the last of the wounded, and I filed that conversation away privately as the moment I stopped thinking of humans as an unusually resilient baseline species and started thinking of them as something the Concord's existing vocabulary simply did not have adequate words for yet. I want to tell you what happened to the crew of Harlow's Reach. Because I think it matters more than the fight itself. Chief Engineer Okafor went on to help design the first joint human-Concord engineering exchange program, the same program that, decades later, would put human cadets in Concord academies in the first place. Petty Officer Lim's improvised triage techniques were formally incorporated into Concord emergency medical doctrine within 6 years, an unprecedented speed for institutional change on that scale. Tomas Reyes, the quiet cargo specialist who beat a void rack to death with plumbing and then explained fear to a 400-year-old war veteran like he was discussing the weather, never sought recognition for any of it. Commodore Sorenval told me, years later, that when the Concord offered Reyes a formal commendation ceremony, he asked instead whether they could simply put the money toward better emergency equipment for future survey crews, because, in his words, the next person who gets stuck out here shouldn't have to improvise with plumbing if we can help it. That, more than the fight, more than the impossible math of soft skin and no natural weapons taking down an apex predator, is the detail Commodore Sorenval always circled back to in his lectures, and it is the detail I want to leave every cadet with now. Humanity's Deathworld reputation did not come from cruelty or from some hidden reservoir of savagery waiting to be unleashed. It came from a species shaped by a homeworld that demanded competence under pressure as the baseline cost of survival, refined across their entire evolutionary and cultural history into an almost involuntary reflex to protect the people around them regardless of personal cost, and then handed absolutely no shortcuts, no easy trade-offs, no biological free lunch to make any of that easier. They simply decided, collectively, generation after generation, that giving up was not an available option, and then they built an entire civilization on top of that decision. So the next time one of you watches a human cadet calmly dismantle an opponent twice their size and then apologize for being late to an exam, or hears about a human squad captain out-strategizing a war doctrine centuries in the making, or reads about a Deathworlder girl in some arena somewhere doing something that violates every model of baseline mammalian capability you were taught to expect, I want you to remember that none of it started in an academy. It started on a dying ship, with no witnesses, no expectation of glory, and 6 exhausted people who had already decided, long before we arrived, that they were not going to let each other die. We did not domesticate a Deathworld species when humanity joined the Concord. We were introduced to one, on its own terms, mid-crisis, covered in scorch marks and improvised bandages, and it looked us dead in the eye and asked whether we were here to help or here to finish the job. I have spent the 4 decades since that day making very, very sure the Concord's answer is always the first one. I would recommend every species reading this file do the same, because I promise you this, the version of humanity that shows up when you are not their enemy is the best ally you will ever have in this galaxy. It is only the version that shows up when you have decided to be their enemy that you should genuinely, seriously fear, and by then, in my professional experience, it is already far too late to change your mind. This has been xenolinguist Vesa Orunkel, Concord Assessment Corp., filing the origin record for classification, Deathworlder, class dismissed.